Namaste. My name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center. And we are delighted to host this program today. It is the launch of Ambassador Vijay Gokhale's new book, The Tiananmen Square, on the Tiananmen Square incident. It is, it's rare to find someone who's an efficient practitioner and a thinker and a theoretician, someone who can actually administer well and think, step back and take a deeper look at the events that are going on. And Vijay Gokhale ji, Ambassador Gokhale, is that rare individual. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. Gave me an insight into China that one didn't have before, and therefore we are utterly delighted to be hosting Vijay ji on our platform today. If you could be brought up on stage, please.
Thank you, Amishji. Thank you very much. It's a delight to be on your show.
Namaste, Vijay ji. If I can just read out your introduction, and then I'll bring up the gentleman who will be in conversation with you.
Sure.
Vijay Keshav Gokhale ji was the 32nd Foreign Secretary of India. He also served as ambassador to Germany and China and as High Commissioner to Malaysia. His 3 assignments in Beijing spanned an 8-year period over 3 decades. He now lives in Pune. And for those of you who haven't read this book as yet, shame on you guys, you will know that Vijay ji actually spent his time, he was in Beijing during this incident. And he truly had a ringside view because his house actually looked over the main scene of events out there. We all our viewers eagerly look forward to listening to you, Vijay ji. And Samir Saran will be in conversation with you. If Samir could be brought up on stage, please.
Good
Hi,
to see
Samir.
you.
Absolute pleasure seeing you. If I may just read out your introduction. Samir Saran is the president of Observer Research Foundation, one of Asia's most influential think tanks. His research focuses on issues of global governance, climate change and energy policy, technology and new media, and India's foreign policy. He curates the Raisina Dialogue, India's annual flagship platform on geopolitics and geoeconomics, and chairs Sci-Fi, India's annual conference on cybersecurity and internet governance. He spearheads the foundation's efforts to foster new international partnerships and globalize its platforms. And in fact, we are hoping that this indeed is the first of many events that we do hope to do together with Observer Research Foundation and with Raisina Dialogues. And we couldn't have a better beginning than this. Before I leave the conversation to these 2 fine gentlemen, if we can have the book launch. Unfortunately, those old days when we got a wrapped book and we had the pleasure of ripping the wrapping paper off, those days are sadly gone now. But we try to make up for it on the Nehru Center platform by doing an online digital launch. So if we can have that video, please. And here's the book. For all of you guys, the book is available already in India. It's available on Amazon UK as well. Do check it out. It's a wonderful, lucidly written read. And Samir, over to you.
Thank you, Amish. And I also want to reciprocate our desire to work together with the Nehru Center, especially under your leadership, and put together a series of interesting conversations, dialogues and debates for the global audience that logs on to your events and your hostings. So thank you very much for your partnership. I'm delighted to be here with Mr. Vijay Gokhale. I have in some ways had a quasi-term under him, hosted 2 Raisina Dialogues under his leadership. And I can confirm that he is exacting in his expectations from you. He is very precise in his communications with you. And he is very vivid in putting together and images of what he seeks in any particular endeavor and task. And this book, as Amish ji has already mentioned, is not to miss. Under 200 words, I was telling Mr. Vijay Gokhale that this is ready to be a Netflix miniseries. There are exciting moments, fast-paced, in-depth assessments of what transpired ostensibly around the Tiananmen Square incident, but in reality, his book is about the decade that changed China. It's more about the post-Mao era and the emergence of a new Chinese way of engaging with the world and with themselves. And he, in this particular book, pieces together the role of vocal contributed to China that perhaps we struggle to understand or engage with, or perhaps enjoy doing business with at this particular moment. But before I quiz him on many of these aspects that his book in many ways presents to us, let me ask him, sir, why this book? Why now? And why do you think this is extremely crucial for all of us to engage with?
Yeah, thank you, Samir, and thank you for that nice introduction to my book. Why now? Well, I couldn't write before this because I was still in service. And therefore, there was a certain conflict of interest. But I always wanted to write this book because for me, this has been, in my entire diplomatic career, probably the most abiding memories that I have had. And it used to intrigue me even when we used to visit the Tiananmen Square during the incident, as to whether the Chinese version of events was the correct one, which is that a small group of people were out to overthrow the Communist Party of China, or whether the Western version was the correct one, which is that an upsurge of democratic sentiment was being expressed among the Chinese people. And I felt an Indian perspective was important because remember, this was the Cold War, and therefore it was easy to take sides. And perhaps one of the few countries which had the advantage of not taking sides was India. So I
Mhm.
thought an Indian perspective was interesting. But there was a second reason I wrote the book, and those of you who live in London will particularly appreciate this. We all grew up reading Dame Agatha Christie, the writer of crime thrillers. Her play, The Mousetrap, ran in the West End in London for 34 years. And a number of actors changed, the producer changed, the director changed, the play ran on. Now, really, the actors have gone. Yeah, those who acted out in the Tiananmen incident of 1989 have either passed on or they're all middle aged. But the play continues. The Communist Party continues to remain the dominant ruling party in China, except that it is stronger, it is better equipped, it is now looking at the possibility of dominating the world. And therefore, while the players have gone, the play continues, the theatre is the Tiananmen Square, and therefore I felt the book not only had a historical relevance, it has a contemporary relevance as well. And that's why I thought I must write this book.
Mr. Gokhale, your posting in China, 1989, when this incident was playing out, was early days in your career, and of course, you were uh, in that city at a time when India was seeing certain changes as well. That was an important decade for India as well, some would argue. When you reached Beijing and when you saw this unfolding from your balcony sometimes and by walking down to the crossroads at other times, uh, did you ever think that there was something relatable? Or was it an alien conversation that a diplomat had to grapple with?
It was difficult for me, coming from a democracy like India, to relate what was happening in Beijing to what was happening back home. Because very early on, we recognized that this was not a democracy movement in the way that it might happen in India or in other Western countries. It was a protest movement, all right, and students had many of the grievances that Indian students would have, but it wasn't a democratic movement for political change the way that the West was looking at it. And in this, we were fortunate in that we had a number of senior colleagues in the embassy who had served during both the Cultural Revolution as well as in the early 1980s. And from their experience as well, we were able to gather that this was a phenomenon rather peculiar to China, and that's how we began to look at it. And I think that's why perhaps we in the embassy got it right much earlier than many other diplomatic missions and even some of the Western media.
No, in fact, you have cited the Western media at a couple of places in the book, and I'm going to come to you on that particular aspect a little later. Let me first ask you uh, about the central protagonist. Right through the book, this is actually perhaps one of the most lucid assessments of the Deng Xiaoping era. It's about Deng and his experiments with uh, the post-Mao China, and how do you preserve the centrality of the party, open up the economy, allow a little bit of liberalizing, and yet ensure iron fist rule of the Communist Party. Uh, in your time there, when you met other diplomats, be it your colleagues in the embassy or others, what was the aura of Deng Xiaoping in the 1989 when this incident was? How big was he? How big was a patriarch as a patriarch?
Oh, Deng was by far the tallest leader in China. And I think right from the moment Mao died, when Deng became effectively the leader in exile, he just dominated Chinese politics. But I think he stood out from Mao in three ways. First of all, he had an economic vision.
Mhm.
Mao was a great political strategist and a tactician par excellence. But he didn't have an economic vision. In fact, if you recall, he led China down the road to economic disaster with the Great Leap Forward. Deng had an economic vision. Secondly, he had the courage of conviction to carry it through. And although today it's easy to say that China developed because of a number of right actions and policies, we must remember that Deng was, as he himself put it, crossing the river by feeling the stones. It wasn't as if he had any example to go by. So the courage of his conviction made him ensure that he stuck to what he believed in, his vision of economic reform and opening up. The third thing with Deng was he combined a certain ideological rigidity with political and tactical flexibility. So he was not willing to give up the absolute leadership of the Communist Party, but if it suited him, he was willing to abandon his appointed successors. Anything to survive and anything to ensure that the larger objectives, which is the superior rule of the Communist Party and economic reform, would not get derailed. For this reason, I did, towards the end of the book, say that while Mao was, in a sense, the founder of the People's Republic of China, the real maker of modern China is, in my opinion at least, Deng Xiaoping.
No, so at this stage, let me invite all of you to send in your questions. We will try to integrate your posers in our conversation this evening. So please do use the chat box and send in your questions for Mr. Vijay Gokhale. Mr. Gokhale, when I read your the book for the first time, I got a sense that you have portrayed Deng Xiaoping to be someone who changed his mind a few times, be it around the leadership questions, be it around the pace of reforms, be it around the experiment with a more liberal political system. Is my assessment correct? And what do you believe were some experiments that Mao should have, Deng should have pursued rather than giving up on?
Yeah, there was one immutable core position that there was no question of Deng relenting on, and that was the absolute dictatorship of the Communist Party of China. So when that issue came up vis-a-vis any other issue, that issue automatically took precedence. However, on every other issue, Deng was a very pragmatic politician. He realized that there were certain limitations, that although he was the tallest leader, there were other revolutionary leaders still alive who had a substantial influence in the party and who during his difficult times had actually rescued him and saved him from a much worse fate. He also understood that there were younger leaders who were technocratically more capable than him, people who understood economics or who understood technology. People like Li Peng, for instance. Li Peng was an engineer. So were many of the others, including Chang Zemin, for instance. So he understood he had to carry them along. He also very correctly read the people's minds, which is that they were yearning for stability and for economic prosperity after being exhausted by 3 decades of mass political campaign. So in that sense, he took all these different realities and he tried to steer a course which would take China on the road to economic reform while ensuring that the Communist Party's hold did not slip. Now, in this process, of course, he faced internal challenges from within his own party, from within his own colleagues. He also faced rising public expectations, which he realistically could not match because although China doubled its national income in the 10 years from 79 to 89, it was still a limited budget he was playing with. And he had to also deal with the international community, which on the one hand, particularly the West, which on the one hand saw him or saw China somewhat as an ally in the fight against the Soviet Union, but on the other hand also looked upon it as a not free state under the communist rule. So he was juggling many balls in the air, and it is truly remarkable that he was able to keep them all in the air. And I believe at the end it was the courage of conviction, his sense that what he was doing was right and he had to persist with it, which led to ultimate success.
The interesting question by Archana Pradhan on did West misread China? And since you did mention Western capitals and their engagement with China and their assessment of China, let me just read her question for you. Did the West misread China and sign its own doom? Now, I think this is a very stark question, but perhaps this is a good entry point into the discussion on how were the Western capitals responding to the happenings of 1999? How did they assess Deng Xiaoping? How did they assess the others who were also important voices during this particular period? And I'll come to the others in my next question. But Western capitals and this incident.
Samir, the West, in my opinion, not only misread China in 1989 during the Tiananmen incident, but it compounded the mistake by continuing to misread China in the 2 decades between 1990 and 2010. The reason, however, was that because the Chinese economy opened up and gave such an unprecedented opportunity to the West to make money and to do business, a lot of the other expectations were dampened down in the hope that business would flourish. And therefore, at least when I was posted in Beijing, for instance, between 1997 and the year 2000, this was the period when the West was interested in getting China into the WTO. They did downplay other concerns, including human rights, as well as concerns on minority issues and so on. And this became even more pronounced in the subsequent decade from 2000 to 2010, when, for instance, we saw that Western leaders virtually stopped granting meetings to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for instance. Now, therefore, there was a heightened sensitivity to Chinese concerns. And in return, the Chinese, of course, greatly helped the West in building its own economic prosperity. What I think the West misjudged in this process was China's capacity to adopt technologies and to leapfrog over them. This was a mistake that they ought not to have made, because they had already had this experience with Japan in the 60s and 70s, when they thought that Japanese companies were simply copying their technologies, but in fact Japan was massively innovating. This is what happened in China between 1990 and 2010. Investment in R&D, in science and technology, and in higher education created an entirely new class of Chinese capable of a great deal of technological innovation. But the West continued to believe they had the edge. And therefore, it was only in 2010, when the global financial crisis hit, that they realized that China now had a technological competitive edge as well. And my opinion is, by then it was perhaps too late. China had become a true competitor. So the West not only read China politically by assuming that they would be more democratic as they developed, more importantly, they misread China's economic and technological intentions. And I think that will cost them much more dearly.
I think that's something that our German friends must hear more carefully. Your inputs on this particular issue. But let's step back to the Tiananmen incident, 1989. In your book, you describe three other important stakeholders. There were many that you have covered, but I think there are there are three cohorts that are important. One is something that you describe as the elders, the group, which is the speed breaker, the circuit breaker, the moderators, those who are the guardians of the faith, as it were, the Communist Party bearers, office bearers. You also speak about the role of the army. In fact, Deng was himself protected by the army when he was in trouble at some point. And then you talk about this and the rather haphazard attempt to create and put together something significant in terms of a protest or an uprising. There are three cohorts that you describe here, and there's a brief engagement with the media. Or the Communist Party's control of the media, but yet the media having some ability to publish controversial and sometimes editorials that would incite and evoke public responses. So, what was your assessment of these four actors then, and where are they now? Those four institutions that you have described so carefully in your book. What has been the evolution of those four in 2020?
So it was a very layered event in 1989, and China is a very complex and layered political system. We tend to look at it as a monolith, but of course, the history of the first 100 years of the Communist Party, and we are celebrating, China is celebrating the 100th anniversary of its founding this year, is one more often of factional infighting rather than of one leader leading the entire party in unison. As for the first cohort, which was the elders, at that time they were enormously influential because this group had fought in the so-called revolution, had beaten the nationalists during the Civil War, had also suffered under Mao during the Cultural Revolution, and they were all in their late 70s or early 80s and believed that now they were finally masters of their country, and they needed to create a system which allowed their subsequent generations to benefit from the revolution. And therefore, while they were perfectly willing to go along with the more reasonable economic reforms, when Hu Yaobang tried to institute political liberalization or even an anti-corruption drive, they saw this as threatening to the benefits that their children and their grandchildren fully and legitimately, in their view, should have derived from the successful revolution. Of course, ironically, 1989 also spelt the death knell of the elders because this was their last hurrah, in a way. After that, Deng moved fairly decisively between 1989 and 1992 to ensure that the influence of the elders diminished so drastically that by 1992 all opposition was gone to the reforms, and none of them ever again became powerful. So even the subsequent generation, the Li Pengs and the Jiang Zemins, they never really became powerful at all. Now, as far as the second cohort was concerned, which I presume were the younger leaders, is my understanding right? Now, of course, they realized that in 1989, what Deng was saying was made eminent sense to them, which is that their power depended upon the stability of the Communist Party. If the party diluted its role in any manner, they wouldn't remain in power. And Deng explained to them the importance of this by using the word life and death struggle. This was a very critical phrase that he used on the a couple of days after they had quashed the Tiananmen incident on the 4th of June. He said it is a life and death struggle. And he meant it literally, because if the Communist Party was overthrown, what he was saying is, you won't just lose your political position, you might lose your property and you might even lose your life. So they realized this soon enough. And as a result, for 2 decades, the political succession was among the most peaceful anywhere in the world, from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao, and then from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping. In the last 2 decades, there has been no problem when power has passed from one generation to another. The third cohort, of course, was the students. Now, of course, the students, after Tiananmen, obviously, there was a certain amount of repression. And the Communist Party made 2 clever moves. The first clever move they made was that they narrowed down the perpetrators, the alleged perpetrators, to a very few in number. If I remember, there were 21 wanted people on the students' list. And what it did was, after it caught some of them, of course, escaped to the United States via Hong Kong. But when it caught some of them, after they completed their prison sentences, the Chinese state actually encouraged them to go abroad, to take a scholarship, for instance, to Princeton or to Yale. Now, we must remember that the Soviet Union made a very big mistake in this regard. Their political dissidents, Solzhenitsyn, Anatoly Sharansky, and others, were all shipped off to the Gulag. You allowed the Americans to beat the Soviets over the head because of that. Now, of course, when the Chinese told these dissidents to go abroad, it was not only ensuring that the West didn't have that stick, it was also ensuring that the ground was cut from under these dissidents. They were just no longer valid in China anymore. Or as the Chinese would say, their influence in China was cancelled. As for the rest of the students, Samir, look, there have been 30 years of real growth year on year, 6, 8, 10, sometimes even 15% per year. We've, in my 30 years in China, I have seen astounding, sometimes staggeringly astounding growth, which is translated into a real change in the quality of life. My own sense is that while the students continue to harbor some expectations of freedom of speech and expression, if their socio-economic needs are met, many of them might not be as willing as they would otherwise be to raise their voice. So I think the Chinese state has satisfied their material wants, and therefore that cohort is quiescent for the moment. The last cohort was the media. And Samir, that's very interesting, because in Tiananmen, if there is one cohort that I actually had admiration for greatly, it was the Chinese media. The Chinese media, in fact, was truly reporting the facts as they were occurring on the ground, sometimes in a manner that was extremely damaging to the party, and they must have presumed that there was a threat to life and limb. So we should not assume that the Chinese media, merely because it is controlled, necessarily means that all the people there don't understand what is going on. But of course, propaganda is a critical element of the Communist Party's survival plan. And they have got a strong grip on the propaganda organs. So I doubt anytime soon we are going to see a similar sort of outbreak of freedom of expression.
I also wanted to ask you about the PLA, the army. We have seen in the past that it was an independent actor to a certain extent. In fact, they defied the chairman himself on certain occasions to safeguard certain actors. Deng Xiaoping was one of them. Does that army still have that individual agency in your estimation? 1989 versus 2021. How has the PLA changed in its character and nature?
Well, firstly, it's become a more professional army because they have got the equipment and the training to professionalize, and it has therefore become a less political army in the sense that part of the professionalization is regular transfers and postings, and therefore you do not allow what Mao used to call mountain topism, which is you sit on top of one mountain, and by the end of 20 years, that general or that marshal basically commanded that mountain, and nothing could happen in his kingdom without his approval. So, in a sense, the reforms that have taken place under Deng, under his successors, and most importantly under Xi Jinping, have ended mountaintopism. So, the army has become much more professional and much less political. Secondly, I would say that what Xi Jinping has done is essentially ensure that the army is now getting politically re-educated again, and that has been his principal thrust. He has understood very well that in the 20 years after Deng died, because Deng's two immediate successors were not revolutionaries, they had not commanded armies, they had not fought the civil war, a serious divide emerged between the PLA and the party. And I think Jiang Zemin's Xi Jinping's whole effort is to rein them in again. And that reining in is not just possible by taking control, because he has taken control, but by a certain propaganda and political re-education, which again and again underscores that the party owes its loyalty, the army owes its loyalty to the party before the nation. Incidentally, Samir, do you know that when the PLA does its parades, the party flag precedes the national flag? I mean, we cannot conceive in India of the political party in power placing its flag before the national flag. So that should tell you where the real power vests. But what I think now, in the last 6 to 8 to 12 months, is Xi Jinping's real concern, is the worry that materialism and well-being has so seeped into the population, and of course the population includes the PLA, that they might be losing their quote-unquote redness. So the new phrase in China is red. The PLA is supposed to be redder than everyone else. Culture is supposed to have the red thread in it, and the party is supposed to pass the red gene onto the next generation. This is now the key word. The word is red. And in this regard, the party being redder than everybody else is a basic recognition of the fact that ultimately what Mao said in the 1940s is valid today. Power springs from the barrel of the gun. The gun is the PLA. You have the PLA on your side, the Communist Party is secure in its position. The PLA goes against you and you have a problem. So I think that we've come a long way since then, but that my own sense is President Xi is basically coming to grips with the situation.
Your book also suggests quite clearly that some of the current modern day assessments of China were possibly true even in 1989. The desire to engage with the world on economic terms, benefit from economic engagements, grow their businesses, create these special economic zones. Um, the idea to maintain political muscularity to defend your ideological moorings, to defend your worldview. Um, why are we surprised by Xi Jinping? Because Deng Xiaoping actually was very similar. In fact, in your book, you suggest that he has invoked the same line 30 years earlier or 25 years earlier by asking party cadres to do propaganda.
Yes.
That we're not doing enough of propaganda, we need to take it to the people, we need to do it more loudly, we need to do it more smartly. And Xi Jinping in 2021 is towing the same line. So how is Mao separated from Xi Jinping as far as managing China goes?
Yeah, so I'm very glad you've made that observation, Samir, because I do want to reinforce the point you've made, which is while the modalities of action are different, and that is because Xi Jinping has many more instruments to use than Deng had, simply because the economic cake is much bigger. The basic objective is the same. The basic objective of Deng and Xi is the perpetuation and self-perpetuation of the Communist Party. And therefore, my own view that Xi Jinping, in a sense, is deviating from Deng's legacy is only partly true. Yes, he has deviated in some ways, such as ending the division of responsibilities and the collective leadership. But then Dunn had to do that under unusual circumstances after losing two successors. On the other hand, Xi doesn't have that problem. He has been anointed as the decisive successor. Besides that, he has many more instruments of power. He has money. He has a much more powerful military. But I think the goal is the same. So, what I entirely agree with what you say, which is that there's really no change in the basic objectives of the Chinese Communist Party, and perhaps generation after generation, we rediscover this a tad too late.
Mr. Gokhale, I have a question from someone from your city, Amit Paranjpe. Uh, he says, in your assessment, what was China's inflection point from the bide your time strategy of Deng to becoming more assertive in the recent past? Was it the 2008 financial crisis? Was it some GDP target or trade number that they had in their mind that they had crossed? Was it some political or social development in the West that encouraged them to change gears? Or was it purely Xi's personality that decided to change the grammar of the old game that Deng had instituted?
Three things, Samir. Firstly, the two wars that America initiated in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and then the global financial crisis, convinced the ideologues of the Communist Party that the West was entering a period of relative decline. Now, right from the days of Mao, the slogan was the East will rise and the West will fall. And they were now seeing this, in a sense, materializing on the ground. So, one reason for the shift in policy was, my sense, the two wars and the global financial crisis, which they saw as the weakening of American hegemony globally. Secondly, of course, was the spectacular economic growth they had demonstrated after the Tiananmen incident and up to 2010. And I think 2010 or 2011 was the year where they crossed Japan to become the second largest economy. So I think the Chinese leadership also recognized that now the economic progress was irreversible. Growth was well on its way to their target. And it was now unlikely that the West would be able to, in any case, destabilize them economically. So these two factors, their own economic strength and their perception that the West was in decline, combined with a third very powerful factor, and that was a growing belief that the United States now wanted regime change, that their view of China had changed around 2008 and certainly by 2012 or 13. Now, of course, the Chinese always believed that the Americans wanted regime change. So if you look at internal party documents from Mao Zedong's time and Deng Xiaoping's time, they also warned their party cadres that the real problem is going to come from the United States. But until they needed US capital, equipment and technology, they were willing to swallow that problem. By 2010, that need was much less. And therefore, I think it was a combination of what they perceived as an American decline, their own economic rise, and their fear that the United States might now attempt a regime change before it became too late. And the result was a sharp change in direction from biding your time and hiding your fire in the bushel to coming right out in the open and saying that, you know, China is now moving to the center of the world stage, which is as good as saying that you know, American hegemony is coming to the end and we might just be the next hegemon.
Mr. Gokhale, in your mind, in your, you've engaged with that country more than anyone else in this part of the world. And I have always argued that you're the finest non-Western scholar on China, and I hope you write more in the coming days. But just to ask you this question that Nipun also wants to know, and I also want to know, where does wolf warrior diplomacy come from? What is the historic basis of this very aggressive Chinese propagation of ideas?
You know, Samir, my view has been, and if you talk to anybody who negotiates with the Chinese, that being a government official, a business person, a think tank expert, or anybody, and you have had your share of discussions with the Chinese, when they talk to us, when they talk to foreigners, they see negotiation as grand theatre. Everything is theatrical. They will explain to you the food is, they make the food theater, they make the room in which you have a meeting theater, they make their gestures theater, and so on. Now, my own view is that wolf warrior diplomacy is the latest part of that theater. So when it suits them, they will play the victim, and when it suits them, they will play the sort of jilted suitor. And now they are playing the aggressive wolf warrior. The objective is basically one way or another to beguile the opposite side. Whether it is through intimidation, whether it is through generating sympathy or empathy, the Chinese are very good at this. So my sense is that perhaps there could be the possibility that President Xi Jinping is telling his diplomats to be more aggressive because China can afford to be more aggressive. That is a fact. But I think there is a stylistic element to this. This is part of theatre, and we have to take it at that. And we need not get riled up because of what they say or do, but we need to push back in the same way to let them know that we are onto them. I think that's the basic way in which we should deal with the Chinese.
Before we come to the pushback, let me ask you another question. And that is that, in your assessment again, have they changed their approach prematurely? Or do you think this moment of being highly assertive, and this is a question by Vinayak Pandey, this Chinese assertion, is the timing correct in your assessment, or have they bitten more than they can chew?
You know, Samir, if I could actually answer that question, I might earn a couple of $1 million. But the short answer is this, Samir. I think that they have developed enough confidence in themselves, both economically and technologically, to believe that they can hold their own in the world diplomatically as well as militarily. So, for instance, I don't think they are intimidated any longer by US military power or by the possibility of a serious setback to their economy because for some reason or the other there may suddenly be a blockade from the West or a cutting off of economic ties with the West. I think that self-confidence is critical. My real focus would be on their political situation, and here I want to draw a contrast between India and China. The view in China is that India is a very fractious polity, that there is no unity in thinking, and that as a democracy we are not going to get very far. This is a theme that has run through Chinese academics and academia for at least 3 decades. And whenever I have been posted in Beijing, Samir, I have told them, yes, it is true that on the surface, there is a lot of fractiousness and division in Indian politics. But the bedrock of Indian polity is 14 general elections with the peaceful transfer of power. That is political stability. Political stability is not that the opposition and the government hold hands and play Ringa Ringa Roses all the time. Now, if you look at China, on the surface, there is perfect political stability. But below that, the system is as brittle can be. Because if they are all that popular, if they have done so much for the people, why are they shy of putting it to the test? And therefore, I think that what we really should be watching is not overreach in terms of, not what I call imperial overreach, which is overreach abroad in diplomatic or military terms, but the rot from within. And in this regard, Samir, I don't believe that this is something which is fanciful thinking on my part, because let me quote a sentence from President Xi Jinping's own speech, if I recall it correctly, delivered earlier this year at a party history conference. Xi Jinping said, the fortress can be most easily breached from within. And the Chinese words were Paole Sheromi Songnei Pu Kung Po. Now, in other words, what he was telling his party guys was that, look, if we are internally weak, if there is a crack in the Communist Party, the rest of the world will stop us. But we have to be strong from within. So where is the problem? The problem is internal. He knows it too. And for that reason, if you look at the budget, China is perhaps the only country in the world where more money is spent on the police, on the internal security apparatus, than on the external security apparatus, which is the military. That should tell us. That should tell us a lot.
So your book very lucidly, in many ways, engages with the kind of politics Deng Xiaoping had to manage. We spoke about the elders, we spoke about certain other actors, we spoke about his own proteges whom he had to get rid of to protect the party. There is some parallel drawn in terms of how Xi Jinping had to sideline and remove some of his own challengers as he was ascending the throne from Bo Xilai and others. Uh, do you think he has succeeded in that project of becoming the paramount leader like Chairman Mao with no opposition? Or do you, because you have just in some ways hinted at this in your last response, or do you believe that there is a possibility of a party throwing up new surprises?
I think he's the dominant leader, Samir, but I think we should not conclude that he is the paramount leader, because even Mao and Deng couldn't establish paramountcy for any lengths of time. They were dominant leaders, but there were challenges within the party. And the one reason I wrote Tiananmen, particularly from the Indian perspective and for Indians to read, was to show them that this was a window in which we could look through the Communist Party and see the inner workings and recognize that this is not a monolith at work, but in fact, just like any other political party in any other part of the world, there are problems within. The only difference is that in India, these problems spill out into the open because we have a free media, we have civil society, politicians in India like to air their grievances in public, whereas in China, that doesn't normally happen. So I'm not saying by any means that therefore there is democracy in China in the way that there is in India, but we should also not assume that Xi Jinping has crushed all dissent. In fact, immediately after the COVID period, when China was going through a difficult time in February and March, I think there were rumblings of dissent, because the manner in which he began a purge in the internal security apparatus, particularly the public security and the People's Armed Police, gave an indication of that. You don't purge people unless you feel a threat to your power or your security.
So, Mr. Gokhale, we have a question related to this from Kalpit Manikar from ORF Mumbai. He says, how do you see succession pan out in the post-Xi era? Or is it too premature to talk about the post-Xi era?
Given the fact that he has removed the two-term limit on the presidency, it might be premature to talk of the post-Xi era, but we should not be surprised if he gives up the presidency. The presidency effectively is the least important of the four positions he holds. He holds the general secretaryship of the party, the chairman of the Central Military Commission, the commander-in-chief of the Chinese Armed Forces, a title he has taken which Mao and Deng never took. In other words, he is now in operational control of the army as well, not just in political control. And finally, the presidency of the People's Republic of China. Now, the presidency arguably is the least influential, although it is the most visible in public. So, if at all he would give up any of his positions, it would be this one. The other three he is not even constitutionally required to give up. But my sense is that he probably thinks that his his mission is not complete. He sees himself as the guiding light of the second 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party, beginning from 1st July this year. They begin their second century. And he sees himself being the guiding light. So I suppose he would have to be around for at least 5 years to set the course, as it were, to be the Mao Zedong of the second century. Therefore, for those reasons, I don't see him demitting power in 2022 because the party congress is next year. I think the Xi Jinping era will continue for the rest of this decade.
So, as we move into the last 10 minutes of our conversation, I have to bring up India. I was resisting the urge to do that sooner because I really wanted to have focus this conversation on your book. But in many ways, there are lessons for us in the book itself. Your last posting in China was 2016. Is it correct? As ambassador to China, or was it 2000?
I left at the end of 2017.
No, you reached China in 2016, right? Is that correct?
Yeah,
Or
January,
15?
yes.
January
No,
2016.
January 2016. Yes.
So when you landed in China, did you expect that you would have Doklam in 2017? Was there any signs that you would be forced into a confrontation and a negotiation that Doklam, in a sense, forced upon us?
I would certainly say, Samir, that when I arrived in Beijing in January 2016, I immediately realized that the atmosphere of the relationship had changed.
Mhm.
And this was also the impression I got when I did my briefings in New Delhi, because we had already had the Depsang Bulge incident
Mhm.
and the tumor incident in 2013 and in
13.
2014. In addition, of course, in the course of that year, we had the Chinese side making strenuous efforts to block our entry into the nuclear suppliers group, as well as the attempt to block the listing of Masood Azhar in the United Nations when the Jaish-e-Mohammed had undertaken the dastardly attack on the Indian forward operating base in Pathankot. And therefore, I did recognize that it was going to be a different time from my last tenure in Beijing in between 1997 and the year 2000, when I was the political counselor and subsequently the number 2 in the mission. Um, of course, Doklam is an unusual situation in that it involved a third party. But let me put it this way: I was not surprised, and we have seen that happening again last year. The message is clear that this is not something which is being done at the local level or even at the level of a theatre commander or a divisional or a corps level. This is a political, well thought out political decision, and we have to contend with it. Now, there could be any number of reasons why they have tried it. It may be to test our mettle, it may be to reduce our influence, it may be to gain some territory. That's difficult for me to say because I'm out of government and I haven't seen any recent papers, and China is a bit of an intransparent government. But it's fair to say that we can no longer treat this as a local passing incident.
Okay. 2013, let's take that year as the year when our relationship changed in some sense. And that is also the arrival of Xi Jinping into our bilateral as well. Uh, why? Why India? And why this aggression towards India? What do you think is driving this new Chinese approach to India?
Samir, I don't think we should look at it in Indo-centric terms because it isn't about India. Uh, Xi Jinping takes two important steps in October of 2013 and November of 2014, which as Indians we must focus on. In October 2013, for the first time ever, Xi Jinping holds a diplomatic conference on border affairs. To my recollection, no Chinese leader had done that in the 60 in the preceding 60 years. And Xi Jinping's message was, we need to strengthen relations with our neighbors and our periphery because unless we do so, we can't fulfill our destiny. And I presume the destiny is global hegemony. Now, this is important because we are perhaps one of their most important neighbors, certainly the second biggest after Russia. So automatically, because the border and the periphery went up in their priority within a year of Xi Jinping taking this meeting, we came in the crosshairs. Okay. There were others which came in the crosshairs as well. The South China Sea, for instance, Japan, the Senkaku Islands, for instance. We all came in the crosshairs. The second was 2014, the work conference on diplomacy. Again, there were such conferences held by Mao and Deng, but these are seminal conferences where fundamental policy is decided. And this was the conference at which Belt and Road was decided. It was decided that the forward posture of China would not be military so much as the development of infrastructure in order to bind Asia and the Indo-Pacific to China. And again, because of Belt and Road, we became an obvious focus. We are not only a large country and a large market, but we also are surrounded by our neighbors whom the Chinese wanted to make inroads in. So I think that very early on, these signals were clear. And what transpires subsequently fits into that understanding. Now, we therefore need to go back and take a look at these two meetings, see what they said, and then anticipate what is to come in the years ahead. But my own sense is that what is to come in the years ahead is intense push by China into South Asia. Because as the recently translated PLA Academy of Military Sciences book has shown, although this is a book produced in 2013, it has shown that China has moved its defensive perimeter from the Himalayas to the northern Indian Ocean. In other words, we are now the buffer for a fight between the United States and China. Any fight that takes place in South Asia. They don't allow the Americans in the southwest to reach the hinterland of Tibet and Xinjiang. And that means they need strategic control over the region. They need to pacify the periphery. To the extent that we resist that pacification, we will have a problem in the relationship with them. On the other hand, I think as Indians, we should know that even at the height of Chinese power, in the second millennium of the Common Era, India was never a tributary of the Chinese Empire. Southeast Asia became tributaries, Nepal became a tributary, Bhutan became a tributary, parts of Central Asia became tributaries. India never became a tributary of the Chinese Empire. Therefore, history stands with us that we stood as an independent power even then, and we have to believe in ourselves, this is my view, and be prepared to stand alone. Of course, being prepared to stand alone means you need the economic and the military wherewithal. And I believe, therefore, that, frankly, withdrawal from the free trade agreement, RCEP, was, in my mind, a strategic mistake. But I think the larger direction of policy that governments in India have followed, including the current government, is to recognize the fact that India has the capacity to stand apart. And I think that government will take all the necessary measures to ensure that we do that.
Mr. Gokhale, some of us have argued that perhaps it's time to take a leaf out of the Chinese book. The Chinese found no contradiction in doing business with someone and benefiting in economic terms from a certain country, while being absolutely obnoxious when it came to the political relationship. Do you believe that India is not getting the template right? That we are trying to fit everything under one rubric when we deal with the Chinese, and we have to have a disaggregated approach if we have to respond to this relentless Chinese onslaught, economic, military governance?
Well, I think we have to, if we have to increase the share of the cake, it has to be through foreign investment and through trade and technology transfers and business as well. I think that there's no doubt about. And let me relate a rather amusing story which took place in 1990 between one of the cabinet ministers who had come from India at that time. It was the VP Singh government and a Chinese leader, at which this minister expressed his surprise that China was allowing foreign direct investment and these large Western corporations to move into China. And weren't they worried about their economic freedom? And the minister recounted our own experience with the East India Company. Throughout the conversation, there was a rather bemused look on the face of the Chinese leader. At the end of the conversation, he turned around and said, "But Mr. Minister, if somebody invests in China and want to get out, we would encourage them to get out, but they can't take plant machinery and buildings, can they?" And that said it all. There was no need to be concerned because you had control. And the China of 1990 was not the China of 1890. And I believe the India of 2021 is not the India of 1921. So my own view is we need an open regime on foreign direct investment from abroad. We need to stop being worried that we are going to be looted by them. To some extent, they will benefit, and profit is a motive for any economy. But what we should be careful of is over dependency on the Chinese market and on Chinese equipment and on Chinese trade. Because at the end of it all, they have weaponized economics. And between them and the West, they are more likely to weaponize it in our case. So, in the balance of scales, I would say that Atmanirbharta is the goal. But pending our getting to that stage, it would be better to open the market to the West than to Chinese investment or to depend on business from China.
So we have come to the end of the hour, but I want to pose some rapid fire questions to you and one longer question. So rapid fire question from Dikti Sangani: will China grow old before it grows rich? How will it impact its attempt to become a superpower?
Samir, my view is that the age of artificial intelligence is here. China doesn't necessarily need to keep a population of 1.4 billion. If they can hold the population to about 1 billion, I think that they will be both old and rich by 2050.
We have Ravi Chandran asking you that authoritarian countries like China are more efficient than democracies. Democracies can't seem to get anything done.
This might be the view in the short term, Samir. As I explained to you, in the long term, China is a very brittle system. When it collapses, that collapse might be catastrophic. And therefore, I think we need to watch what is happening domestically rather than what China is doing externally. I don't think the race is over. I think we've just begun that race.
There's a question on the COVID lab theory, but that's a different discussion. We'll leave it for another time. But let me ask you my final question for this evening. If you were living in Taiwan, how worried would you be today? How you've seen how the West acquiesced to the Chinese reordering in Hong Kong. You saw the complicity of the media houses. You saw people move aside to allow the Chinese to do what they had to do in Hong Kong. How worried should you be if you were living in Taiwan today?
Let me give you the Indian perspective. I would be worried for 3 reasons. Firstly, I think the Chinese have developed adequate anti-area access denial to deny the United States an ability to be a first responder in such a manner as to thwart any concerted Chinese effort to regain the island by force. Secondly, I believe that Xi Jinping feels that this must be completed before 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the establishment of China. Otherwise, in other words, he is linking China's prestige with the reunification of Taiwan in the same way that the United States, for instance, linked its prestige to the defeat of Japan in the Second World War. The third thing, I believe, is that and we should know this as Indians, when it comes to our sovereignty and territorial integrity, we are prepared to make the sacrifice. So we should not assume that Chinese are not willing to sacrifice temporary economic growth, some amount of difficulty, even some amount of conflict in order to reunify their homeland. And therefore, we should look at it from this perspective and we should plan for that.
So as we conclude, and since we are virtually hosting this out of the London Nehru Centre, what would your parting advice be to your colleagues in Europe? What should they be thinking about today as they have their internal debates on investment treaties, on partnership with China, on the Indo-Pacific strategy, and indeed on the relevance of the transatlantic order of the past? What would you like to tell them in a minute to consider as they make these decisions in the days ahead?
Well, Samir, I think there's already a growing realization in Europe that they need to recalibrate their relations with China. It is now not just a strategic partner, it's a strategic rival as per the European Union's own document. My own suggestion would be that they need to ensure that other countries, particularly other primary principal democracies, are encouraged economically to create an ecosystem where China doesn't emerge as the dominant power. Let us remember, the history of Asia is not a history of conflict. It is a history of domination through economics, not through colonialism or brute force. And therefore, what China is doing is dominating the region economically. It is important, therefore, for the Europeans to support the rise of India, to support the rise of ASEAN, to support the rise of East Africa and the Middle East, so that China doesn't become the only go-to country for capital, technology, and equipment. And my own sense is that I don't think that that realization has come yet. That realization needs to come, and it needs to come fast, because I have no doubt that in the next 5 to 8 years, the Chinese will surpass the United States in nominal GDP as well, not just PPP.
The only game in town that could be the Asian future unless we all collaborate and work together. Thank you very much, Mr. Gokhale, for the fascinating interaction this evening. It was my privilege to be in this conversation with you. I read your book, I learned a lot, and I would recommend all of you to go out and get this masterful, in fact, a masterclass on a very important decade that shaped the China we engage with today. Sorry, Amish, for the delay. I'm handing it back to you.
No, no, no. Thank you so much. Fascinating program. Beautifully helmed, Samir, and look forward to many more conversations, many more programs with ORF. Vijay ji, absolute pleasure. You're a source of insight and on actually what will be the defining uh, uh, struggle, if we may call it that, or the movement over our generation, actually, over the next 20, 25 years. There's still a lot more to be learned. Thank you so much, Vijayji, for gracing
Thank
the
you.
center.
Thank you, Amishji. Thank you, Samir. Thank you very much. Beautifully conducted. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.